So happy to be with all of you. Excellent. So I think we are super happy and honored to have so many participants connected from all continents. And I think it is now time to start this 22nd Global Digital Encounter. So it's a very special honor to have with us for this 22nd Global Digital Encounter very prestigious speakers from all continents. We decided to dedicate this Global Digital Encounter connecting academics, students from all over the world, including my Bocconi students, and also professionals and government officials. We decided that for this very important first autumn encounter, we would dedicate it to the dilemma between open science and intellectual property. Is open science a new way that can blossom, or is intellectual property interacting positively or negatively with it? It is a model that is largely developed already. What are the hurdles? What are the limits? How can we make knowledge and new knowledge circulating better and in a safer way? This is the question that these are the questions we have asked to our panelists. Fide and the Transatlantic IP Academy, for now more than 2.5 years, put their strengths together in order to organize these encounters that are not simply encounters like webinars. They are regular meetings between the best academic scholars of the planet, accompanied by readings. So after the meeting, all participants will get the registration of it. They will also have access to the readings that are on our website, and a team of some 30 PhD candidates from all over the world, including from our universities and including from my Bocconi, is drafting a report on each encounter. This means that students, academics, IP officers, professionals can find a wealth of knowledge to consider while studying the various topics of our global digital encounter. So open science really developed steadily, and its role has become more central in the research world for business and for citizens. And this is why the new models were developed, and we absolutely want to urgently have more clarity on its relation with classical IP. We have asked 4 exceptional scholars to be with us. First of all, Prodromos, who will have today a major connection problem, but will join us later on in the chat. And above all, we have our colleagues, Richard Gold from the IP Center of McGill University in Montreal, Canada, very active in the field of IP and of new models for IP. Richard is also the author of various publications that relate to this topic, including a very recent one. So we are super happy that he can connect together with a large North American audience. We have with us Roberto CASO, who is the chair of the Italian, the president of the Italian Association for Open Science, very active throughout the European continent, and who tries to develop really bridges so that traditional intellectual property rules do not impede access to knowledge, new knowledge to develop, and permit researchers to blossom. Professor Roberto CASO is professor at the University of Trento. And we also have with us Professor Julien CABAY from the Université Libre de Bruxelles, from ULB, one of the most prestigious as well in Europe. He's known to be one of the key specialists of copyright and open models on copyright. He runs in Europe various projects and various labs that make his university shining, and the 3 of them we'll really try to bring replies, first replies to various questions. Then we will have further encounters in the coming months and years on this super important topic. So this is really an introduction to this topic. I would wish to thank our speakers, but also our donors who permit that this activity be totally pro bono and be made in favor of our esteemed students, including the ones from our universities who are connected at this time of the day. And also, I would wish to thank the numerous academics, colleagues from IP offices and from companies who are with us in this late afternoon in Europe, in this morning in the Americas, and in this very late evening in Asia. So with these words, I would really wish that this 22nd Global Digital Encounter enlightens as many of you. You remember that after the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes of discussion between the panel, the floor is to our audience to raise questions, and our speakers and moderator are eager to reply to your questions. The event is yours. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give now the floor to Javier Fernandez-Laschetti, who under our leadership of Professor De Santis and myself as director of this activity, is the coordinator of it and is also one of the main thinkers of these activities. Javier, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Laurent, and thank you all for coming and for being part of our community. Just a few words as usual. Thank you for the panelists for being here with us and for sharing information and knowledge with us. And in a very, very interesting questions such as the one we will deal with, a dilemma, yin and yang, as the Chinese would say, how to keep a balance or have a balance between all the interests and the behaviors of all the people that is involved in research and development, in the studies, etc., and so on and so forth. So very happy to be here once again, and remember that you belong to a community and that we share with you information. You can do it as well and share more information with us. And that's all I wanted to tell you, and I'm giving now the floor to Richard to start immediately the encounter. So Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Buonasera, bonjour, hello everyone. Welcome to this encounter. We hope to run it in a very open science manner where I will pose a question, but I'm asking my colleagues, Julien and Roberto, to elaborate, take it in their direction, push each other, and hopefully the result is a good mess where lots of ideas come out, but lots of possibilities remain. So I'm going to start, Roberto, with the first question and turn to Julien after. And this is the fundamental question, you know, open science, wonderful, great, do it, but it's impractical. No company will ever invest. You'll never get businesses involved. It undermines the incentive. So fundamentally, are IP systems and open science incompatible? Is this just an academic dream, or does it have some real world meaning? So Roberto, I go to you first.
Thank you so much, Richard. I try to reply to your first question in a very simple way. I think intellectual property and open science are not compatible in absolute, but open science is not compatible with an expanding regime of intellectual property, an expanding regime of more exclusive right. As a European, I have the experience of sui generis right on database, and sui generis database is probably the most impressive example of the conflict between open science and intellectual property, because this kind of exclusive rights the scope of this right was, in theory, in the European policy to foster the database industry in the European Union, but probably the effect was the opposite, because we know the industry was developed in other countries and in other geographical areas. At the same time, the sui generis right is a very difficult right to manage in the open science systems, in the university, in the research institutions.
I'm sorry.
I think
I keep putting myself on mute here, so I'm undermining the whole ethic of open science, which is sharing, by keeping my thoughts and my voice private. So I apologize. Thank you, Roberto, and I turn to Julien.
Thank you. I do not know whether these two models are compatible or incompatible as such. It's probably the features of those models that are making these compatible or not. So it depends how we do think of it. So, for example, one of the things I do see as incompatible is the very idea of national territories and limitation related to IP. So IP rights are territorial. If you do think of science, and furthermore, if you do think of open science, it has to be worldwide. It has not to be facing like these type of territorial limitations. So typically, for example, in my country, there is a right to publish in open access. They are trying to make it possible at the international level, but in practice, it's quite difficult to make sure that typically what has been published in Belgium will be made accessible in open access, even though there is a contract stating that the law governing the contract is, for example, US law or English law. So that makes it complicated. That's a typical example of the compatibility between the two. But if we were thinking of another model of all the features, it might be possible. Another incompatibility, for example, is related to the fact that we can't divide science on the one side and commercial and industry on the other one. So an example of the thing I do see as a problem is, how do you make in the EU the difference between the text and data mining that is allowed for scientific research now without limitations, and the one that is possible for commercial purposes, but that is subject to opt-out methods and measures. So that's the new text and data mining exceptions from the Directive on Copyright and Digital Single Market. And there is an overlap between the two. But the problem is that if you do this for science, how can you make sure that in practice you won't be facing the limitations that are allowed under commercial purposes? So that's typically the thing. It depends on how we do think of the connection. My idea, generally speaking, is that so far it is not as open as possible, and it is probably more closed than necessary, which runs in contrary to the idea of open science, which is supposed to be as open as necessary, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. But it depends on the features.
You know, some great points, and it makes me think of two things. First, a lot of open science depends on IP. So if you think about open source, for example, that aspect, in fact, without copyright, there is no open source, because we use the copyright to ensure openness and building on the public domain. It's also in my area, which is more health sciences, life sciences, the use of data exclusivity, because if we use data exclusivity instead of patents, it's completely compatible with sharing knowledge, right? Because the person who controls the data package for pharmaceutical approvals, etc., has control over it, but can release it to the public. Others can build on it, use it. I can disclose the results of clinical trials without undermining my exclusivity. So I think you're quite right. I mean, Roberto made this point at the beginning. It depends on the regime and how it's set up, that different IP regimes have different levels of openness to it. And I guess the second point that comes to mind is, you know, the IP system doesn't work in many areas, right? And I'm just thinking of rare diseases, pediatric diseases, antibiotic resistance. In that last field, for example, firms are closing their laboratories. They're not developing antibiotics because there's too much uncertainty in the market. Those traditional methods don't work. The companies that had promising drugs went bankrupt. So we need alternative models that don't rely on the patents and raising money that way and getting to market. We need much more of a collaborative and multi-stakeholder approach to innovation. So it might turn out that there's some areas where we rely primarily on IP, but if we ignore open science and think it has no commercial possibilities, we are locking ourselves out of many promising things. Do you have a last word, Roberto?
Thanks, Richard. I think if we want to investigate very deeply the relationship between intellectual property and open science, we have to take into account other aspects. For example, the incentives of researchers, young and old researcher, in terms of research evaluation.
So let's move into that. That's where I wanted to go. I'm glad you led us. So why don't you continue, Roberto, on this question number 2 about incentives, particularly in both the academy and industry between different generations. So please continue.
Also, because if we want to incentivize other forms of science, that is collaboration, not competition, we have to build also a research assessment system based on the cooperation and collaboration. And just to let me to quote, to cite the debate in European Union at the moment. We are discussing a new agreement on reforming research evaluation, and the idea is to take into account also not only publication and not only quantitative metrics, but also other forms of practicing science, in particular, especially the collaboration, the cooperation among scientists in order to give to the society the science itself.
Julien, so what do you think about incentives, whether within the academy or larger than that?
So, regarding the incentives, I do think that we should value other things than publications, and that's a good way what we are running now because of what, for example, Roberto just mentioned, because actually these are valuable outcomes from a scientific or education perspective too, to do other things that publishing in very high ranking and with a very high impact factor journals. So typically I'm working with other scientists from other disciplines here where I've got my research unit with copyright lawyers and IP lawyers in a fab lab. So we are working with engineers, with physicists and so on, trying to collaborate together. But definitely it's complicated from the very beginning to end up with things that are valuable in the current assessment system of research, because we are just doing new things which are completely different than what has been done before, trying to connect the dots between our expertises and so on. So it takes other forms than traditional publications. So we are not valued in doing this, whereas we really do think that's a much better way to work because it's collaborative. We can rely on an international network. We can rely on the know-how and the collective intelligence of so many disciplines. I think that's a really good thing. And regarding the problem, I do see as well with the incentives and the current system is that basically any researcher starting a research in the traditional model has to start with a state of the art. And that's quite difficult to do it if you do not have access to the publications. And here it puts like the different researchers under very different conditions. I have the chance to be a member of the staff of different universities, so I can just add, let's say, the access to the different databases, so I can bring a better state of the art than some of my colleagues. And if we do think about the difference between the North and the global South, I mean, not everyone is put in the same situation, whereas the researchers are really good mind everywhere, not depending on their resources, but depending on their minds. So I really do think that we should find other ways to incentivize people in doing other things that are actually highly relevant from a scientific or education perspective, and that would promote open science.
Yeah, that opens up a whole bunch of questions. I mean, if think about a junior researcher just starting out, maybe they're a doctoral student or a postdoctoral student in science, and they want to get a job. How do they do so? The traditional way is, you develop your own proprietary data set based on your research, and you bring that over, and that's what attracts your university, the new university hiring you to bring you over. So if everything's in the open, what do you bring? And, there's some really interesting examples out there. And, young people, there are not enough jobs for all PhDs and postdocs. And so there's lots of competition, lots of worry. What's interesting to me is that the younger generation, now that I'm old, people just starting out are excited about sharing. It's actually an attraction. And so here at the Montreal Neurological Institute, when they announced they're going open science, people were interested in coming. It wasn't a worry. And what I've also seen is there's a postdoc working at the Structural Genomics Consortium, which is open science. And she published like her lab books every day or every week, mistakes and everything. And one would think, well, that would, who would hire her? All her mistakes are public, but also she has nothing proprietary to bring with her. Well, one day she gets a phone call from someone in the senior in the pharmaceutical industry saying, I saw your work, it's really interesting. How do we collaborate? So it opens up opportunities. I think we tend to make ourselves believe there's one pathway forward, when in fact there are lots of different ways, reputation, networks that provide value to researchers. And the same thing happens at firms. There are a lot of firms that take up an IP, protect it, follow a pathway to find out, 6, 8, 9, 10 years later, that pathway is not going to work. The market's not there. They can't raise the money. And there's a new pathway available, but they've so locked themselves into relying on patents that there's not enough patent life left for them to continue, so they drop it. And this happened with some drugs around diabetes, where they tried out one thing and it was only late in the life of the patent they found something else. Well, at that point, they just dropped the whole thing. So the whole project and all the public investment that went into creating it in the first place was lost. Roberto, I don't know if you want to talk about, maybe disincentives that exist that we need to overcome. Like if you were at you are at a university, but if you were making the assessment chart for junior colleagues, or what they had to do, what are the disincentives within the university? What's telling them not to do this that we really have to think about?
I think the most relevant disincentive is the research assessment based on the individuality and the metrics, bibliometrics based on this idea, because probably the history of science teaches us that science is in itself a cooperative enterprise. Is an history of collaboration. So if we teach to our students and PhD students that they have published but has single author and they have climbed rankings in terms of impact factor, IH index, and so on. This is exactly the opposite of fostering open science. But at the same time, I think there is also another big problem nowadays, and it is the control of infrastructure. We have to invest in the public sector, non-profit sector, in terms of public infrastructure. In other terms, we have to offer to our students and to our PhD students, younger researchers, alternatives to the big tech environment, because as Bjorn Brems and other colleagues wrote 1 year ago in a famous paper named Plan I, the most important challenge is in terms of infrastructure. If we, as a public sector, non-profit sector, if we let to the only to the private sector, and in particular to the big tech, the monopolies, the control of science and the anterior communication system, we do not offer alternatives to our young students and researchers.
Thank you, Roberto. And that, I think, moves us nicely into the third question. And by the way, those in the audience that want to ask questions, start thinking about it, because in about 10 minutes, we're going to open up the discussion for your questions. But let me go back to Julien. Julien, one of the strange things, and you pointed this out when we talked before, is, copyright, the creator has to pay multiple times, to access their own work and so on. There's that they don't get the benefit. They're paying for someone else to get the benefit, which seems kind of a strange mechanism that may be different than patents. And I'm wondering, I probably messed up the explanation, but can you elaborate on that notion and talk to us about the not so much disincentive, but the strange way of thinking about this that IP sets up?
Yes, and thank you, Richard. It's just an idea that came to my mind quite recently. I started thinking there's something really strange in the scientific publishing model when you do think of copyright, which it relies on, and that you compare with patent. Actually, in this traditional scientific publishing model, you are an author, a scientific author, you own the copyright in your work, and you have to waive your copyright through licensing to the scientific publisher. That will make money out of it because it's a business, but you even might ask you to pay for the article processing charges in order to get this science, which is supposed to be a common good of interest for anybody, in order to be in open access. So basically, you own the copyright because you've been creating something, and you pay for having this work you've been doing disseminated to all people who might make use of it. And you don't get money for this. Actually, you pay for this, and public means are involved a lot into this. And I started thinking, if you do compare with the patent system, actually, in the patent system, what you're gonna get if you get a patent is an exclusive right. But if you want to get this exclusive right, you have to do two things. You have to pay for getting the exclusive right, and you have to disclose your scientific invention. So basically, it's to me, it's quite the opposite. In the traditional scientific publishing model, you do pay for something you already have an exclusive right on in order to make this public. Conversely, in the patent system, you do pay for getting an exclusive right subject to you making the science being public, being disclosed. So it's something I don't understand how we can admit this in the field of IP, generally speaking, and in relation with science. It's the same thing, and it's a mismatch to me. So I don't know what you're thinking of, but it's really weird.
It's a very interesting thought, and since you've mentioned it before in previous conversations, yeah, it's got me thinking. But Roberto, maybe while I'm still thinking about this, you could jump in and react to Julien's point.
Yes, I completely agree with Julien. It's a paradox because if I publish a scientific article as a scientific author, I don't receive money for this publication, contrary to the other sectors of publishing system. So this is why there is also a law and economics literature on this, and probably our participants remember the famous paper of Stephen Chauvel about the paradox of academic copyright and the proposal of Chauvel to abolish the copyright on academic publication, exactly for this reason. Because there is no rational economic rationale in the copyright transfer agreement to the publisher. If I transfer all my rights to the publisher without a monetary compensation, this is a completely a disaster from a traditional point of view. If we want to defend our academic freedom, and Julien rightly stresses this point, because the original ownership is of the author of the article, of the publication, we have to imagine a sort of secondary publication or communication right in order to achieve open access. If I am the author of the article, I have to republish the article in open access because this is exactly what I need to guarantee my autonomy and independence in the academic sector.
Really interesting. I'm grappling or trying to grapple with Juliana's point that patents are aligned, because as a patent scholar, our job is to think about how it doesn't work and how we can improve it. That's what we get paid to think about. But I do appreciate this point that at least the alignment of who gets to benefit from the right is the person who applies for it. I mean, it's not exactly true, because if I'm an employee of a company, I don't, but the company paid my salary. So I do get that point about alignment. And that may just be something that's particularly strange about the academic publishing world, that the system we develop for scientific publications is just strange. We've known that for a while. I don't think it's necessarily remedied, though, by simply open science, because we still are paying the publishers to publish our stuff. And we have, I mean, one of the advantages, I guess, of the copyright in the work is that while I pay for it to be published, it's not as much as I would have to pay if I'd pay all the cost of putting a paper out through the peer review process. So there might be an argument that while I'm paying for giving it away, I'm paying less than I would if it were completely open, but I'm not sure about that. On the patent side, in some ways I'm hurting myself. Yes, I do publish it, but if you're a good patent agent, you can hide a lot. And it's not like everything I invent, I put out there, right? It's very, if I'm any good, I will strategically give away some information and not others. But I'm really potentially, I'm curtailing the ability of others to enter. Let me start again. I'm creating an atmosphere where there's a lot kept secret. And so, I need it to be secret until it's published. And then I also am encouraging other companies to keep it secret. If I'm thinking about clinical trials, I do a clinical trial, it has a negative result, I have no reason to disclose it. And what that comes back to, when it comes back to me, I fail to benefit from their investment. So we're all collectively paying higher prices to access pieces of knowledge. So company A investigates a drug, finds it doesn't work, doesn't tell anybody. Company 2 does the same thing, comes to the same conclusion, company 3, and so on. So we put a whole bunch of patients at risk, all this money wasted. And that's because I've chosen a system that is based on secrecy with limited sharing due to patents. So anyway, that was interesting to me. I'm starting to see that there are some, there's a question here. And the first from Malcolm Bain is, obviously open science is not just about publications, but also the entire method of the science and the processes, labs. So how do we do peer review? How do we do selection of projects? How do we train people, etc.? So he asked, how does this interaction between IP and secrecy rights and the business models, interfere based around maintaining this know-how? How does it interfere with the process of science beyond just academic publishing? Don't know which of you wants to start. Maybe I'll start with you, Julien. So beyond the open publication and the whole publication, where else does open science become an important tool to advancing the process of science?
I would share just an experience in order to answer. Because I don't, as a, let's say, as a lawyer, I mean, my research is not necessarily related to the disclosure of my processes, because most of the interesting thing is the outcome of the research with the interpretation of the law and things like this. But I can share in another experience where actually I do run a project with engineers, and we do perform text and data mining, and we do actually have a data sets that we've been creating. The problem is that this data set is actually a data set which is partly based on data we could just scrap and so on, and others that we got through a contract with a public company, basically an intellectual property office, and we are not supposed to share these things. And that's a pity, because actually the data set we've been creating is probably beyond the state of the art for the tasks we are doing in the field of engineering. So it's about computer vision, it's about finding out similar trademarks through deep learning, and there is a state of the art, there is a current data set available in the literature, but we got a better data set, but we can't really share this, and actually that's a pity. So the only thing I can do as a lawyer, and that maybe is giving me an advantage compared to other scientists, is that I know how to negotiate maybe with the others when we draft the contract. So for example, at the very beginning, I could negotiate on some terms in order to allow us to do a few things that, according to the initial provisions, we couldn't be allowed to do. So that's one of the things that is, to me, would be my takeaway. If we do want to promote open science, we need also to train researchers in some legal aspects so they can know actually what are the rights, and they can know how to negotiate a few things in order to foster openness of their research. Because let's say very often they just don't know, they fear what they're signing, and they're just saying, okay, oh, it's not for me, and therefore they actually end up signing things they wouldn't do if they knew, or if they understood exactly what would be the consequences regarding the research. So that would be a good thing also for open science, learning a bit of the law.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go to you in a second, Roberto, but in fact, we're building, we've recognized this problem as well, and we're not the only ones, that there's just it's not just open science that they have to learn about, it's also about IP, because I think people have exaggerated ideas about what IP is and what it gives them. And unless they see IP contrasted with open science and the different business models that exist, how can you expect someone starting a company to make a good decision? if we want the market to work, they have to have information. And so we're trying to build that certainly in Canada. Roberto, did you want to comment on the larger issue of, that open science goes beyond open publication and how that can really transform or energize science?
Yes, thanks, Richard. I try to put the question in other terms because I think secrecy and strong intellectual property right interfere with the scientific process because some of this process is in the hands of big companies that practicing scientific process without showing the logic and data at the center of this process. In other terms, if a big company like Google are the power has the power of processing data and control some of fundamental scientific some fundamental pieces of the scientific process, and this is the discussion of BREMS, but also of Spark and other organizations nowadays. We are losing the control over some fundamental piece of the scientific process. In particular, if we don't know the logic, for example, of artificial intelligence applied to the scientific data from the big companies, we are losing the control of a fundamental pillar of our scientific process. This is why there is also a discussion in Europe about the idea to reform legislation in order to give to the university and the research centers, public research center, the control over data and scientific process. There is a discussion about, for example, the so-called Digital University Act. Karen Max, director of University of Amsterdam, 1 year ago spoke about Digital University Act in order to imagine a new generation of European Union legislation based on the idea of the control of data from of the university system.
Thank you, and just a reminder to those attending to please in the chat if you have questions to type it out. But one thing that's bothered me for a while, and I'm just throwing this out at you, we haven't discussed this, but national security. So some concerns, I guess there are two types of concerns. One is if everything's open, AI programs, facial recognition, very invasive technologies, or biological information that could be misused, etc. If everything's open and we have open systems, aren't we increasing our security threat? On the other hand, IP also increases security threat because often the company or the entity supporting the development of the technology might do so for a regime that's authoritarian or controlled by an authoritarian regime, and we're locked out of it. So, maybe it's not a yes or no answer, but in terms of thinking about national security and these very important areas of research, how do we think about the role of open science? Does it need constraint? On the other hand, does the IP system need constraint? We ban certain types of IP going outside the country, etc. Julien, can I start with you?
I have a thought, but that might be connected there too. It's not necessarily about national security as such, but in a broader sense, is the idea of open data that is very put to the forefront nowadays. And I got a fear quite important with the very idea of making all public data open to anyone, because actually my big fear is this openness as to data which are usually useful and relevant for many, are going to be appropriated, and there is this commodification of this these data and the refined data. For example, the many public open data that have been mixed together in order to identify patterns thanks to AI systems on that actually leads to better data, which will be appropriate. That seems to me a problem. So here, I do see a connection with what you're saying is this thread about thinking of open science as everything should be open. Maybe not, because when you do connect open science, openness with some exclusive rights, because this is still the paradigm we're living on. We're not getting rid of IP. We're still living on this. There is this idea that you can connect the two and end up with something that's bad. And for example, that's what we've been seeing in the open access model, actually. We stated we should open everything, and the publishers ended up with a business model where you do pay for getting your work published. So they're in favor of open access because it's actually a great business model for them. So the idea of openness might be actually a threat for national security, because it's still in a world where you do have IP. That means exclusivity and closure. So yeah, I would agree with you. There is something kind of touchy on that aspect.
Roberto?
Thank you so much, Richard, because this question is at the heart of the problem. I think open science is a tool to build democracy and peace. It is exactly the opposite of a world divided by borders and walls and so on. And I think about vaccines anti-COVID-19. And when we discuss this kind of issues, not for chance, we use the metaphor of patent wars or trade secret wars, exactly because there is a geopolitical problem. And from my point of view, the most strong argument in favor of the defense of IP system, Western, in particular the Western IP system, is exactly in terms of geopolitical wars. So I probably this an utopistic idea, but I think we have to dream a better world.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that open science leads to greater security. There are risks, and I think Julien mentioned those for IP, but I think there's also about misuse of information. But to me, open science is not just a single act where I contribute knowledge. If it were, then it would be open to a lot of the criticisms, but it's a practice that a community invests in. And so the expectation is, if I share, you're going to share, and there are benefits to sharing, because it's not just the explicit knowledge that's captured by the database or the publication. There's a lot of tacit knowledge, there's a lot of connections. If you want to be a member of this community, especially at the cutting edge, where it's hard to codify all the knowledge, then you have to abide by certain rules, which is everybody has to share. And if you're seen not to be sharing, it will be fairly obvious. Small stuff, yes, but big stuff. If you're not sharing, you're not going to be part of this community and you will lose out. And so that means that if work is being done in a way that is going in a direction that is harmful, it will become apparent through your holes. You're not sharing information. That means something's going on and people will start questioning it. So I actually think it might be an early warning device to see where people are going. But yes, there'll be abuse, but of course there's abuse now, and we can't contrast open science to a perfect world where there's no abuse. So the question is it going to be more or less? And I happen to think that there's a bit less. Okay, we've got like 5 minutes left, and one of the questions we got is, practically speaking, what's the first step you would take? So how, if we want to implement open science, what's the one thing you would say we do? Roberto, I'm going to put you on the spot. One thing that we need to do to advance this.
Reforming intellectual property, especially in the field of data, because the idea of expanding intellectual property to data is exactly contrary to the historical basis of intellectual property, in particular in the field of copyright, because the dichotomy idea expression was conceived rightly for this reason.
So are you saying that North America got this right because we have no data protection per se? We have a strong fair use, fair dealing exception? Good. We're rarely, the good guys here. Okay, Julien, one thing that you would suggest.
I would agree with the idea of Roberto that we should reform intellectual property. And just to mention, I attended Jan Wilensky's tour for changing copyright and trying to introduce somewhere a statutory license for research publications. And my question to him was, at what level? How should we do that? And my idea, and it relates to what I've been starting with, is that science is worldwide. So the very idea, the first step to me is to try having a discussion, as we did with the Marrakesh Treaty on a copyright exception for the blind, to have a discussion on a treaty at the international level. Because we have different jurisdictions that have been moving towards putting in place these national provisions on open access, but it has practical limitations. So we really should start thinking or trying to push towards having this discussion of an international treaty on this.
Okay. I guess I would actually I'd study innovation. And the key to innovation is trying and failing until you succeed. And I think it's just opening the mindset to experiment. That we know the IP system works in some situations, but doesn't work in others. And policymakers have to set up a space and fund that space geared to open science. We think it's going to work. Let's try it. It might turn out that it's a complete failure, and then we can invest in more IP, I guess. But that strategy hasn't worked particularly well. More IP. So let's try in a sphere, significant funding from philanthropy, from governments, and say, let's just try this. And if it fails, then we know. So that would be my first step. I think we have time for, but we have to be quick. One last question from Valia Araman. How do you think the reward system should be structured inside open science, within an open science paradigm for early career researchers? So we touched on incentives before, but what specifically would you suggest we count or don't count? How do we change the incentive structure for a younger researcher? I'll start with you, Julien.
There are many things that can be done. One of the first things is to consider, for example, as a lawyer, other things that just like quotation by other scholars. For example, when we do have works of us quoted by courts, it means that we're actually influential. It does not appear anywhere. So we have to, maybe we know and we deal with that, and we can just put it in our research projects and so on to show that we have some influence, but sometimes we don't know. So there are many things, and it will depend on the type of the fields of science, because not everyone is influential in the world with the science the same way, and probably not only being quoted by others doing the same thing.
Yeah, so if I were to summarize, it would be measure impact, but allow impact to be assessed on multiple ways. Roberto.
There are many ideas about reforming research assessment, but there is one aspect very important, is to take into account teaching and mentoring new generation of researchers. Because, for example, in Italy, the teaching activity doesn't have any relevance in terms of assessment. And this is completely wrong, because the first way to practice open science is teaching.
Thank you. And I think you've nicely brought us to the time that we're supposed to hand things back over to our sponsors. I think, Manuel, you're going to jump in with a closing word. But thank you both, Roberto and Julien. That was short and hopefully spurred some interest, but obviously there's a lot more to say.
Thanks to you.
Yeah.
So thanks very much there, Richard. Thank you. We do appreciate your skills as both as moderator and as a lecturer. Yeah. By the way, my dear, you are not old at all. We both are still very young. Thanks also to Prodromos, who is with us in these difficult personal circumstances today. Thank you, Prodromos. So there, Roberto and Julien, we are also very grateful to you both. I have the feeling that we could have spent 1 hour more moving from one issue to another, and we have been listening you so happily for many hours. Yeah, I'm thinking now, for instance, the territorial protection offered by copyright law. So how can open science work outside the country of origin? This is, I know that this is an issue that is very dear to you, there, Julien. Yeah. I wonder, as a professional dealing with private international law, whether we should start thinking on an international convention and which institution should foster it. I'm just giving ideas for a next encounter. Yeah. So. I have the feeling also that we have dealt with so many questions. You have dealt with so many questions, and in fact, you just have opened the door to this group for reflection within the global digital encounters on this very relevant matter. I have seen that there have been quite an amount of questions that couldn't be answered today, but they will be answered in written if you so feel like. Yeah. So anyway, it has been a wonderful discussion. You three have opened the Pandora box of an extremely exciting topic, and the main conclusion I take is that we have to devote more encounters, certainly in the future, to the complex relations between open science and intellectual property. These are the reasons for the encounters. Yeah. So all in all, nobody doubts the exponential explosion of the open science is going to change our lives. Yeah. When listening to you, I realize that we are still far from identifying how many things are going to change in the IP landscape, yeah, in the following years. This is just the beginning. Yeah. So many thanks also to those who have attended the encounter. We were more than 100 today, and for those who have sent many questions to the panel. My dears, as you all know, the encounter takes just 1 hour and 10 minutes of the times of our attendance. So now, regrettably, it is time to close this 22nd encounter. But I would like to recall you again and again that we will have another encounter pretty soon. Yeah? The 23rd encounter will come to you this 13th of December, 2022, so just in some weeks. Yeah. And for the first time, we will deal with another very relevant and controversial topic, yeah? Mainly the relationship between intellectual property and cybersecurity. So this is a topic that I'm convinced is also at the very heart of the future of intellectual property. We will announce you the exact hour in the following days. Yeah. So thanks very much to all our speakers, to our moderator, who is not old, to Fide, to TIPSA. Most especially, I always love to thank Álvaro Rivas, yeah, who has taken care of all the technical aspects. Of course, many thanks to all of you for being so patient and for being so loyal to the encounters. I don't want to forget also to thank Magali Contardi and Lara Farrugia. They will take care of the report, something that is very, very precious, and you will have the report in some days. I get that in less than a week. Yeah. So, you know, we are all very grateful to all our followers. We are very grateful for them because they are loyal after 22 times 22 encounters, and we always appreciate very much whatever advice, whatever criticism, whatever suggestion you could provide to us, because we have to improve step by step and encounter our common endeavor. So take care. Come again with us. Coming in with us in some weeks. Do count on you for the next encounter, the 23rd encounter. Take note, 13th of December 2022. So thanks for being with us. Enjoy the rest of the day. If you are in the morning, if you are in the afternoon, if you are in the evening. Bye-bye to all of you. Thanks. Thanks, Julien. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Roberto. Bye-bye.